Welcome to the Creative Condition podcast, an ongoing series of conversations and considerations to help people understand and embrace their own unique creativity for fulfilling lives and brilliant careers. My name is Ben Talon. I'm an illustrator and author, and I bring 16 years of creative industry experience working with the New York Times, The Guardian, the Premier League, and more. And I invite designers, artists, psychologists, scientists, coaches, athletes, sensitivity experts, and all kinds of thought leaders to help us broaden our knowledge of creativity. Creativity is a fundamental pillar of human happiness, a vital ingredient in the solutions to our problems, but so often misunderstood. The show is supported by founding sponsor and B Corp, Illustration X. Take a look at their stunning range of illustrators and animators at illustrationx.com. If you like the music for the show, it's by Dirty Freud, who you can listen to now on Spotify and all good music streaming services. Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Ben Talon. This is the Creative Condition podcast. How are you doing, guys? This is the recap episode. This is what we learned from this week's guest, the wonderful Stephen Bliss. Stephen and I first spoke in Brooklyn in what I think was 2015, what could have been 2017. I'm starting to get old, and my memory is starting to fail me. I had 4 trips to New York in quite close succession between 2014 and 2019. And on one of those trips, I visited Stephen Bliss's apartment in Brooklyn, and we looked at some of his massive Frankenstein artworks, which were these beautiful collages of ripped subway posters that he would make, build up with such depth, and then paint over with more figurative work to sort of make them his own. And I just adored seeing those in person because it was really interesting work. And I loved getting into the brain of Stephen. So Stephen was the lead artist at Rockstar Games for many, many years, and he pioneered the iconic look of those Grand Theft Auto characters, which was the style Stephen was carrying anyway, and developed it with Rockstar and a famous partnership. And we talked a little bit about that, but we picked up at a time when Stephen had left the company and wanted to forge, he wanted to get started on a new story afterwards, a new chapter. So that's where you found us. That was episode 70, if you want to go back and hear that. Maybe I'll put out a highlights edition of that one as well this week, just to keep the momentum going. But we talked again. We talked remotely this time, but it was a wonderful chat. Stephen is visiting England, where he's from, like myself, but he lives in New York, I believe, still at the moment. At least I think he does. Anyway, I didn't even ask him. We got into all the deep stuff, so that's where we were. But here we are to find out and recap on what we learned from Stephen Bliss on this week's episode. You can also now hear the highlights and the full-length episode on the feed, wherever you get your podcasts. A big thank you to the sponsor, Illustration X. You can check out their global range of illustration and animation portfolios at illustrationx.com. These guys are wonderful. Support the industry in many, many ways beyond the commissioning of illustration for their artists, and they've been here since day one. Founding sponsor. Cheers. And also a big thank you. Please do try to help the Ukrainian Institute if you get a chance. ui.org.ua. They're doing amazing work to connect the Ukrainian creative community in this horrific time of war with other companies and the creative community worldwide. So help them out on that if you can. So let's get into it. Number 1. The balance of rest and productivity is not an easy one to strike. Stephen and I talked about the role of discipline in Stephen's early years. His dad was in the Navy, and the way he described it, would return home from working in the Navy and run the house like a ship, so everything had to be a certain way, discipline in the house. And Stephen accredits his work ethic, I guess, to that, his ability to sort of, focus and work and be productive. But he did question how good that was for him. Stephen's in his 50s now, and it's an illustration of that this battle is ongoing. Stephen talks about working diligently and with high focus, spending 2 days on a pair of shoulders and biceps on an artwork, only to not like it in the end, and that kind of has a negative impact, as well as being sort of professional integrity, I highlighted in the conversation the fact that that's cool too. It's good to take such care and pride in your work and want to be that professional and get it right. But you, as to Stephen's point, you do have to manage that. You have to manage your mental well-being, and it's something he's working on to this day. So it does take time to get that balance, but I do think it's something we should be really mindful of. Number 2, the self in the art is often beyond our control. So this is something, it's an idea I've been exploring in my own practice recently, and it's this idea that us as artists, when the viewers look at our work and they pull a certain theme or they resonate a certain way and they read it in through such a lens that is theirs, that they are entitled to that because they are the viewer, they are the consumer of the work, and that interpretation is absolutely right in every bit as much of the way that the intentions of the artist are right. I believe that once we release it into the world and the project, once we put a bow on the project, we have to relinquish control because it's done, and the cycle of life and death is ever present in our lives, in all lives in this world. And I think that's true of artwork too. Once we release that into the wild, it is consumed through other people's filters, so it cannot belong to us anymore, not in the same way that it did when it was in production in our practice or in our minds. So I asked Stephen about how much of him was in the Fear City project, because I read many, many contemporary themes. I pulled such ideas and confrontational observations of this society, this paranoid modern COVID ghost children society that I witness under park benches, the neon suites that I talked about. And I'm pretty sure, by the way, in response to Stephen's point that they're not edible weed, that did make me laugh. But I feel it. That's what produced my stories for the Apocalypse stories. I write a series of fiction short stories which are out there on Kindle if you're a fiction reader. And they are observations and they are interpretations of this paranoid society, of this feeling of brinkmanship, that we are on the verge of many collapses as, social media ramps up its politicizing of everything and its polarization. And I don't think that was necessarily something that Stephen set out to engineer, going by our conversation. I think there will be unconscious aspects of him in there, and he talks about influences like the Warriors and pop culture growing up, and the kind of artistic influence of those. But I do think that we could sit there all day long and we could engineer what we think is the smartest idea, the smartest interpretation of some aspects of ourselves that we think the world will read as such. And then it can be just received in such a different way. And I find that really interesting. So I think it's worth bearing in mind, and I think that should give us some hope in the sense that we can drop the pressure we put on ourselves a little bit. We can create from the heart, we can create with the soul, we can pour everything we want to pour into an artwork. But truly, it lives many lives, and that should give us confidence to go 100% on what we want to do and why we want to make it. And it might even be that as we make that artwork, there's something even more meaningful and even more deep going on in the unconscious that we are not even interpreting as we make the work, and maybe that's what people are reading. It's a lot of maybes there, but I think that should just give us the license to go out there and make work from the heart, from the instinct, and make it pure. Number 3, it's a follow-on from the last point, and I think the audience can help us understand the resonance of the work. So it's a continuation of that point, and I reference in particular Stephen's decision to pull the character Thumper from his Fear City world for his comic that's coming out with Scout Comics. To choose to lead with that character was in response to audience feedback. There was a lot of love for Thumper, and I don't think that's something that Stephen could have engineered either. I think that you can feel a certain way about a certain character. It's the same when I write stories. I had a keen reader of my fiction come back and tell me that a short story that I'd written, Granny's Cake Tin, was their favourite short story of all time, and that's incredible praise for somebody who is rather new to writing short stories and fiction. I do believe in my work, but I also believe it's in its advent. But there will be a rawness and an energy there that I will not be able to contrive in later years as I get more technically proficient. So him pulling that story out of the collection, it's not what I consider to be the best one. I think the idea is maybe one of the best in that collection. In particular, maybe one of my best ideas for fiction, full stop. So a little snapshot. So Granny's Caked In is a very dark fiction. It's a dark fiction story based on the generational thing of grandparents and their filthy, pornographic biscuit tins. So I'd go around my nan's house in the 80s, and the spread that she'd get out, which was kind of mint Viscounts and penguin biscuits and rich tea biscuits and party rings. And I mean, with what we know now about refined sugar and, gut health and the brain and everything else, it makes me shudder. It's probably done me some damage, but at least I was moderated by my parents. They sort of had to rein her in. But this, as I learned as I grew up, is not an anomaly. This is a thing. Everyone that I talked to of a generation has got a grandparent that did that. So I explored those themes, and I explored them with the idea that this had come from a post-war generation who had grown up with such scarcity of resources and incredible hardship in their lives that they went the other way when they got out the war and things got a little bit better, and suddenly these sweets are sort of coming over from, I guess, the Americanization of culture with TV and everything. They absolutely went for that. So this story is about a character Doreen, a character who is a total... She's borderline maniacal with this stuff, and she's created a competition under the pretense of a knit and natter meet-up in a church where they actively bring in documented evidence of destroying their greedy relatives. And it's kind of... They're all angry that they never had this stuff and that this generation is just so sluggardly and obese and have really gone for this, shocking culture of processed food, that they're giving them what they want and they're smashing them to bits with it. And it's really quite horrible, the story, but I loved writing that. But I think I've written better, and I think there are better ones in there, but that's not up to me, and the audience gives you that feedback, and what it's received as is as important as what we make. So to the earlier point, we shouldn't let that steer. We should work with full purity of emotion. And then what the audience does with it should come as a surprise, and a lovely surprise at that, It doesn't mean that when things are criticised either that they're bad. But Stephen talks about Thumper, the rabbit mask on this character, this teenager who becomes really quite evil when he wears this mask and almost possessed. That the audience loved that character, so he used him as the front runner for Thumper, the comic that's out this week on Scout Comics. Number 4. Some projects have a deeper personal reason for being, and we have to let them die. So when I hung up Quenched Music, which I ran with Danny Skerritt, who now works under Dirty Freud, we're still, incredibly close friends. And that project meant a lot to us. It was it was a blast of curiosity. We ran around Manchester's independent music scene, making work for musicians and collaborating on events as a way of kind of just being a part of the city and being a part of this scene that we loved that was bubbling under the surface in the pubs and the bars. And when time came to call time on that project, we both hung it up with a little bit of a heavy heart. But it was done. It had served its purpose. Our lives had gone a different direction, and therefore so had our creativity. And we had to park it, and that's fine. It's a moment in time. I've done talks about the value of that project now, the hidden value of that project. And Stephen talks about moving on from his I, Frankenstein ripped posters project, and how it seemed to me there was some slight confliction there, because it seemed that he had great hopes for that project. And I personally think it delivered. I think it was incredible, but by his own metrics, what he wanted from that project, it didn't work and he moved on. But we talked about how maybe that was a form of exorcism, that he had to do something that was truly emotional after years and years of figurative work that was designed to sell things, as in the work he was doing at Rockstar Games. And as good as that is, and as loved as that is by the audience, he just had to do that for himself. And my point was that it's fine to knock it aside and call it finished. I think as artists, we have a tendency to not do that, and to hold on to things and to try and perfect and polish and keep working on something that is maybe dead in our soul, if you know what I mean. We don't feel it anymore. We feel a heaviness when we come to work on it, and I think you have to pay attention to those feelings and not walk away at the first hurdle. But if something is not moving and it's stultified and it feels like a heavy weight, then we at least have to go and do something else for a while to see whether it sings out to us and calls us back. And the last one, number 5, everything in its right place. So I found it beautiful that Stephen has been commissioned by DC in his 50s. You know, this is a kid who grew up drawing from comic books, from DC and from Marvel, and we talked about that on episode 70 in our first conversation. And I just think it's wonderful. And, you know, he talks about it maybe taking a little longer than it should have, but what is should have? I think that life takes us on a certain journey, and we have to, everything that we get, the whole kit bag that pulls it together is critical for what happens next. So I personally don't think that Stephen could have got there any other way, because he hasn't, and that's the way I see with the life, and that's how I avoid regret and how I keep moving and channeling what's right there in front of me and trying to make the most of it. So there you have it, 5 things we learned from Stephen Bliss about creativity. A big thank you to Stephen for taking the time out. Do go and listen to either the highlights edition or the full-length episode, whatever you got time for. I know there have been some people listening to both recently, so big thank you, because that's awesome. Great for the listenership. I love that you love what I'm doing so much that you would go and do that, so that means a lot. Cheers, guys. Big thank you to the sponsor, illustrationx.com, for taking care of the show since day one. Wonderful illustration agency, and please do go and support the Ukrainian Institute, who you can learn more about at ui.org.ua. See you next week.